Resident Evil 4 is an absolutely iconic game, and my first time ever playing it was on the Wii in 2017, and still to this day the Wii is the best version because aiming with the Wii mote is just that good. Now in 2023 I went back to Resident Evil 4 to review it, and to see what things I want the remake to keep and what changes I wanted to see, so let's get into it. Resident Evil 4 is a special game. Leon is one of the cheesiest characters ever made, and his one-liners and stupid comebacks will never get old.
Been expecting you, my brethren.
No thanks, bro.
The game starts you in a Spanish village and something isn't right. The first encounter with a zombie isn't actually too scary, and that set the tone for the rest of the game. Well, until you meet the regenerators, but we'll talk more about them later. The opening encounter epitomizes everything that is great with Resident Evil 4. Yes, the famous village sequence with Spanish zombies running around, hurling crap at you, stabbing you, and it's intense. I knew what to expect going in, and I was still caught off guard. It shows you exactly what to expect with the rest of the game. Intense action with a stiff character, and it teaches you just how interactive the game is, which is amazing considering how old it is. There are simply so many different ways that you can approach this encounter. You can take it slow by kiting enemies, shooting them in the head or leg, then kicking or suplexing them. You can be a bit more head on with your approach and sprint around like a mad thing, collecting all the items, spraying bullets and using grenades. Or you can do it the right way and go into the main house, find the shotgun and take your time. To be honest, this is one of the greatest opening encounters I have ever seen in a game, and it still holds up to this day. And just as you think everything is well in the world, boom, the chainsaw lad comes out and the whole game gets thrown on his head. He's an iconic enemy, and every time I do this encounter I'm reminded of how great it is. The amount of options you have is staggering, and it's because of this fantastic foundation that the game builds upon that just makes it so much of a classic. The game is filled with encounters like this that I just remember so vividly. There's one specific one that I struggled with big time on my first playthrough. It's the one with the two slicey guys in a room, and it was so hard. But this time I saved the rocket launcher and blew them up in one hit, and it just felt amazing. But now we have to talk about one of the creepiest enemies that have ever graced the Resident Evil games. Well, the ones that I've played anyway. And they are the regenerators. Just look at these things. The rest of the game isn't even scary. Maybe only having one or two jump scares. But then you get to the island and you hear this noise. It's so unsettling. Like stupidly so. And then you see these slow walking monstrosities, and it heightened the horror. I think Resident Evil 4 in the final chapter or two goes a bit too far with the enemy numbers. There are simply too many of them, and it removes the deliberate action that was perfectly showcased in the opening and subsequent encounters. But the regenerators go a long way in fixing this. Having to use the infrared scope brings back the deliberate action that I mentioned, and I hope they keep these guys the same in the remake. From the updated graphics, the game does look a lot scarier, so I have a feeling that that's the point in the game where I'm really going to struggle to play it. I have to talk about the inventory system because grid inventories are my favourite. There's something so satisfying about carefully organising your inventory to maximise the space, and I really hope they stick to it in the remake. Now let's talk about the part that's probably going to be the most contentious of the remake. Leon is a fantastic character. He's just so funny. He isn't particularly deep, and his writing is so bad, but it works so well. Resident Evil 4 has some of my favourite character interactions in any game ever, and this is one of my major concerns with the upcoming remake. The VR port cut out pretty much all of the best lines, which I hate. There's one line about Ashley, and they took out that line and changed up how the interaction played out. And even the more tame lines, like how Hunnigan was lonely, got removed, and it simply makes no sense. Now I do think they will take them lines out in the remake, which is a shame, but I hope they keep Leon's cheesiness the exact same, which I'm hopeful for because in Resident Evil 2 Remake he was still very cheesy. My biggest issue with Resident Evil 4 are the two final chapters. I think the village and castle chapters are top tier, but then it starts to falter a bit, and it's mostly due to the number of enemies thrown at you. I keep harping on about the combat and how fun it is, and at the start the item economy is perfect, and having fewer enemies let me engage with it more. If we take the bridge encounter for example, I was luring them onto the bridge, shooting them and then kicking them off, all while running around, collecting resources and finding the next place that I can play smart, maybe by kiting them towards the barrel and blowing it up. But the later encounters in Chapter 4 and pretty much every encounter in Chapter 5 are too much. I didn't care about ammo or being clever. Instead, you just spray bullets and grenades to beat the encounter. Now, am I saying these chapters are bad? No, I'm not, because they're still really good. But they're like an 8 out of 10, where the other chapters were easily like a 9.5 or 10 out of 10. The boss fights are also disappointing. Once again, I don't think they're bad per se, but barring one or two, they don't have this very expressive way to deal with them. The first fight against the Ogre is pretty easy, but I do love how the dog you saved earlier in the game comes to help you. And honestly, the rest of the bosses, bar 2, are pretty mundane. Salazar is simply just shooting them. It has a cool design, he looks horrifying, but I thought he didn't offer too much of a challenge. Now I do think Resident Evil 7 and 8 may have spoiled me, because I think a lot of game bosses pale in comparison to the Baker family and some of the bosses in Resident Evil 8. I'm so glad I went back to this game because it gives you a lot of context going into the remake. While I found some parts of the game to be worse than what I originally thought, it made me understand exactly why this game is so good. Yeah, the final parts were a bit too actiony and the boss fights weren't exactly great, but by God is it fun to suplex zombies and figure out how to beat these almost puzzle-like combat encounters. Thanks for watching. I recently played the original Dead Space for the first time ever, so check that out. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye. Ow.